So much for having me. It's great to be here. So this evening we're going to spend half an hour or so looking at four main areas: keywording in context, keywording principles, keywording process, and focusing on creative and conceptual keywording. And we'll have questions at the end, but I would encourage you and remind you along the way to ask me if there's anything that you're not sure about or you would like me to just clarify. So diving right in, what are keywords? Keywords are words applied to digital files, which could be images, videos, etc., to enable users to search for and retrieve relevant content. So keywording, therefore, is a process that requires systems and methodologies to ensure consistent terminology and a positive user experience. So part one, we're looking at the context of keywords and the world that we live in and why keywords exist and why they're important. So the scholar Lanks in 2012 used this quotation on Twitter, which really caught my eye. Bad libraries build collections, good libraries build services, great libraries build communities. What I really liked about this is I often think about keywording as being like a librarian, so like a digital librarian, collating information from a variety of sources and making them accessible and available to a variety of users, some with lots of knowledge, subject matter experts, and some with very little knowledge in that particular subject, or perhaps even in how to find and look for information. So with keywording, the aim really is to build a community. So this could be within an organization, on a platform, on a social media channel, whichever your focus. It's about kind of creating an environment where your particular target, your users, your market, your customers can come for information as part of a community and have some shared understanding with that. So a photograph I took in a museum, obviously, if you're into taxonomy or classification of any kind, you'll be very familiar with this idea of organizing information and knowledge management. But bringing this into the context of commercial enterprise and organizations that are operating, for profit or maybe not for profit, but when we're looking at the relationship between keywords and our customers, our users, we can think about it in this way. So Seth Godin, who's a writer and a design thinker, has said that marketing is no longer about the stuff you make, but the stories you tell. And this brings me back to the idea of keywords being one way that we can make content accessible. So we've got a lot of content being made and published online. We've got a lot of target customers and users that we want to reach. But really, it's the keywords that help us do that. And it isn't just about having products, services, and information. It's about engaging and attracting people through the stories we tell. And often keywords are kind of the unsung hero in that entire process, because it's the stories, the keywords that relate to the stories that allow businesses and organizations to really create a community of customers and users. So some research carried out recently by the market research company Edelman looked at the relationship that we have as consumers with brands, and they visualized it in this trust barometer, which is broken down into 5 key areas. And the reason trust is important is because with digital media being so prominent and valuable and important for organizations who wish to sell their products and services, we need to find ways of managing the assets and managing the information, which could be visual, textual, audio, video. All of these assets are very important in creating that sense of trust that brands will use to communicate with their audience. So the brand barometer is broken up into these 5 key areas, which really help to define the importance of assets within the context of the current social world that we live in and the world of the media that we consume. So the 5 key things that the trust barometer would focus on, which reminds us about the importance of these assets and the language that we apply to them, is the ability of the brand. Are they good at what they do? Do they actually resonate with their audience and do what they claim to be doing? Does the brand keep its promises? Is it dependable? How about integrity? Is the brand honest? Is it showing itself in an honest way? Are people believing what they say? And what is the brand's purpose? Obviously, having a positive impact on society is extremely important to brands, to advertising, to this visual communication that we're going to talk about today. So is this coming across through the visuals, and is it being catalogued through the keywords that these brands use? And does the brand resonate emotionally with its audience? Now, you might be wondering, what this has to do with keywording, but I see a clear relationship between how brands wish to communicate, how they wish to sell products and services, what the community is that they're reaching out to. And I see that feeding into the visuals that they publish. And obviously the visuals are part of their asset libraries, their brand asset library. And the keywords will help the organizations access that information and then repurpose it and publish it for their end consumers. So it is very important. And what we've seen over the recent years in terms of brand imagery is an increased awareness of the need for diversity and inclusion. So this is to just put it into context. We used to have photographs of happy families, predominantly white, middle-aged, perhaps middle class. All of these things are being broken down as stereotypes. So we're now having to think about the changing landscape in society and culture, the way this impacts on the visual messaging, and then the keywords that help support access to find these visuals so people can continue to message and communicate. So these are some of the main areas that have really been challenging the stereotypes and preconceptions that we have about imagery. Things like, ability and disability, different body types, different religious groups, sexual orientation. A lot of image libraries, for example, are changing the language and changing the keywords for these particular things to keep up with the demands of the world that we live in, the culture and society that is doing the searching, and how are they expressing these things on the search engine. So obviously these terminologies are always changing as well to keep up with that. So where do keywords actually sit in the process of creating content and creating content that's creative and breaking down stereotypes and boundaries? Well, it's sitting here somewhere in the middle of everything that happens back office operations, everything from the concept that's being created, the photographer, the filmmaker, the entire production process, which includes everything from talent, models, even the art direction, picture editing, and that entire process. Hits a point at some point where the image then needs to be keyworded. And we need to look at now who's going to be doing that, what methods are they using, what processes are they using, how are they organizing this information in the back end? Because obviously we're using it ultimately to reach an audience. So your audience may be internal. It could be that you're managing knowledge and information within an organization. It could be a non-profit, a charity, it could be commercial, or it could be information that's managed for e-commerce purposes. But regardless, you've got this production process. You've got at some point the asset that is in need of keywording or some way to retrieve it. And those keywords ultimately need to resonate, because if you're operating commercially or non-commercially, you need the information to become not only accessible, but really meaningful to your target audience. So we'll have a look at some of these principles. So it used to be, working in stock imagery for so long, that the typical search for first day of school might look something like this image on the left. It's quite a classic kind of stereotypical image. There's a uniform, a chalkboard, and it's quite dated now. More recently, we've seen the same keywords being used, but the imagery has been changing. So we now see something that's far more subtle and more emotional, resonates more with the audience. Again, it needs the keyword, but we're seeing how the art direction is changing, and this is to do with this sense of the brand trust and the need to reach out to your community. But we're also seeing keywords change as well. So we have a lot of keywords around business in the stock image industry. Again, an older example, the image on the left shows how business growth might have been represented on a stock library like Getty or Alamy or Adobe maybe 5-6 years ago. Obviously now business growth means many different things. We've got lots of small businesses, we've got independent businesses, we've got online businesses working in creative and community spaces. And now, obviously, since the pandemic, we've got a whole new way of looking at business in terms of the hybrid business lifestyle, working from home, and kind of what that's impact that has had on imagery filters down through to the keywording process as well. So in terms of the process, the keywords sit in the middle, and I often say when I'm training organizations or people who need to keyword content, that they really connect your customers with your content. So you've got your content on one side of the curtain, and then you've got a customer or a user, to some extent using a database or a search engine, they're online, or some kind of repository, a DAM system, digital asset management. It's keywords really that form that connection between the content that they haven't seen yet, the content that they're thinking about and visualizing, and the keywords that they use to express that image in their mind's eye. And the keywords ultimately are, serve the purpose of connecting them with that content that they desire. And there are 3 guiding principles that I apply during the keywording process, and those principles are relevance, accuracy, and consistency. So by relevance, I mean matching the user's search query with the content, so making sure that the content that comes up when the query is entered into the database is actually relevant. Making sure that the information is reliable and verifiable, and this is particularly important when keywording people, keywording things like ethnicity, sexual orientation, age, and gender. And making sure that the results are always consistent. And this is about optimizing user experience. And we'll look at some examples of how we can implement tools and methodologies and systems to make sure that the keywording process itself is more consistent. So there's a little task here which really doesn't require any more than that from you than just having a think about which keywords you might type in to find this picture. If you were looking for this picture online, or if you were actually keywording this picture, what type of keywords might you think about applying? So this is through the lens of relevance and what is actually relevant in the picture compared with what you can see. So I'm getting you to think about where the focus of an image is now, but not just for you, for a user. So thinking about what would be relevant to an end user. So some of the things that you might have been thinking of, or that might spring to mind, might be the gender of the person in the image, their age, ethnicity perhaps, the activity, because obviously the image is showing an activity and we want to try and convey that in terms of keywords. Anything about the setting? Is there anything that jumps out that seems particularly relevant? What about the object? Do we all know what this object is that the child is holding, and do we all agree on what the language for that would be? And is there a concept, or are there any other themes or ideas or emotions that spring to mind when you look at this image? Because if I was to ask all of you to go away and keyword this image, I'm pretty sure that we'd all get a lot of variety and a lot of different responses to this coming back. So in thinking about one of the main principles of keywording, relevance, what does this tell us? That we all see things differently and we describe things differently. So what jumps out and resonates with us might be different from one person to the next, but then the language that we use to interpret that is also different. And if we don't always know the facts, then this can make keywording very difficult. As I mentioned, there are some sensitive areas around ethnicity, gender, age. You don't have any information. All you have is the image here. So how would you handle this in your organization if you didn't have a model release or the information, the backstory about who this person is? I can tell you that this is an image I took of my daughter. So she's female, and at the time she was probably 7 or 8 years old. This isn't a lake, for example. This is a reservoir called Kielder Reservoir in Northumberland, where I live. So we've got information that I know as the creator, but as a keyworder you wouldn't know, that are relevant, and we need to try and capture that in a consistent way. So the second principle that I wanted to talk about was accuracy. And I just mentioned the access to a model release, for example, can mean that you're able then to apply keywords that are verifiable and factually based, which is extremely important for keywording, particularly on a commercial image library, for example, Adobe Stock or Getty Images. These picture libraries require model releases for commercial images that depict recognizable people, and it's a legal requirement. And also that the keywords that we add as keyworders need to comply with what the model has stated on their form. So an example of this could be if the model identifies as non-binary, we aren't therefore to add male or female. Even if we feel they look male or female, we need to be sensitive to the language that that model or the talent has actually stated for themselves, and we need to feed that into our keywording process. So a model release looks something like this. This is just a section of a release which is available through one of the major stock libraries. And we can see here that in addition to male and female, the model may choose to identify as transgender, non-binary, third gender, or simply, to write in what they wish to be identified as. When faced with this as a keyworder, I need to refer every single time we have a commercial image to what the model has provided in this form. And I need to make sure that I'm reflecting that accurately in my keywords. And again, there's additional fields for ethnicity as well. So in terms of getting accurate information, we need to first of all ask ourselves, is there a model release for the person depicted? Yes or no? If there isn't, then we mustn't guess and we can't infer. If there is, then we can go through the process of adding more information, which is factually based and verified in terms of their age, their gender, their ethnicity, and then enhancing keywords through other things like what was the object that we could see, what was the setting, what were the themes, what were the concepts. So this is where keywording can become quite interesting. And I have been asked about this just before I started speaking to you this evening. What's the role of AI in keywording? And it's just a note on AI really to kind of illustrate to you some of the pitfalls and potential risks involved with AI. So as you know, AI, artificial intelligence, is the process of a machine looking at the image and using that image to make queries of other similar images and instances where keywords have been added to similar images to make an inference and to kind of decide what it thinks is happening. So in this image here, for example, which I think is quite a kind of tricky image in terms of its composition, how would the AI keywording approach look? And this is what came back when we ran this through a tool called Clarify, which is an AI app which you can use in your image database. So the AI came back with beach, water, sea. It's obviously looking at the blue sky, and it's obviously inferring that lots of blue with these horizontal lines typically means beach. This is the data set that it's working with. But obviously in this case, this is not an image of the sea, it's not about vacation, and it doesn't show family. So even if most of the images in your library that show beaches and sea and water have families on them, this clearly does not. So versus the human keywording, where we can get into the real specifics about what we can see, that this is a building and it's about the exterior shot of a building seen from below. And that really the theme is architecture. So, we've got a much better stab at getting these keywords correct than the machine, based on the fact that we can see not only what's visually relevant in the image, but we can go on and enhance that and make inferences based on our IQ that we have as human beings. So this is a note about AI, because although AI is being used quite heavily now in some of the stock libraries, it can often fail and struggle to understand the meaning and purpose of an image. So to have a look at my top tips in terms of these keywording principles of relevance, every keyword is a potential search result, so we need to make sure that we're delivering information that is what the user is expecting. We need to make sure it's accurate and that information is verified. We need to create and follow consistent guidelines, processes. We need protocols in place, procedures in place, and steps for keywording teams and individuals to follow. We need to make sure that the language is relevant. So I talked earlier on about the changing landscape and the context that we live in, all impacting on the language and the imagery that's being produced. And finally, concepts. My top tip is to make sure that you can translate these into keywords. So the visual trends that we're seeing happening in the media, you know, all of this content does need to be classified in a way that can keep up with changes in society, but obviously conceptually these need to be translated into keywords as well. So moving on to the final section, the process itself, I just thought I'd better check, actually. I had forgotten to ask earlier on, but has anybody asked any questions? Does anybody want to jump in and just ask for any clarification at this stage? Just have a quick look on the chat. There is a question here from Heather. What's the difference between keywording, tagging and indexing, and how would you define each? Well, I think how I would define each may be different to how you would, Heather. But I think that sometimes semantics can get in the way when we're talking about keywording. So for me, keywording is when I'm asked to look at imagery, particularly photographs, sometimes videos, and describe what the content of the asset actually contains. So what's it showing? So this is visual attributes, and it does merge into conceptual meaning as well, the meaning and the purpose conceptually. Tags tend to be a metadata field that is perhaps more about navigation. So outside of the world of stock imagery, the tags that I see might relate to a library that has lots of different media types and tags that they try and kind of use to pull those media types together into one kind of type of data, one type of information, but slightly different to keywording, which relates just to what we can see or infer from the actual visual. Indexing is something different. I know you write a lot about this yourself, Heather, and this is more about the taxonomy side of setting up your vocabulary structure. So you could think about keywording as, you know, once you've got a structure in place, this is the bit where you look at the asset, you know, one by one and decide how you think it's going to be most useful to keywords so that a potential customer can find it. So Heather feels that she would call this process indexing, and yeah, and I think semantics does come into it depending on what your organization is, and sometimes even if you're a commercial organization as opposed to an academic institution or a museum or art gallery, for example, there'll be different terminology related to that. So what I'll do is I'll just close down my chat quickly, and we'll come back to that at the end if we have time for some questions, and I'll quickly finish off this part of the presentation. So as I was saying, depending on your organization, you're going to have different media types. We've got photographs, videos, audio files, and then some kind of a system, and your system may refer to them as keywords. It might refer to them as tags. It doesn't really matter. The process, kind of the principles are the same. You're trying to get this information on the asset so that your end user can find it. And I work with clients that have very, very rudimentary system. So it could literally be a card index, or it could be a very big enterprise global DAM system, digital asset management. It really does depend, but the principles are the same. The first thing to think about, of course, is why you're doing the keywording. So you need to ask some starter questions to get this process underway. What is your collection about? How is your collection used? Who searches your collection? This will really help you with creating a strategy for keywording. And is there a context or a story behind the image? And we started out thinking about that at the beginning. You know, why do certain brands need certain imagery to tell certain stories? And therefore, can that guide and influence your keywording process? So the process looks something like this. To describe the key visual elements, so these keywords are literally what we can see happening in an image or a video. Moving into the kind of meaning and purpose of the visual. So again, keywords, but they're more, you know, related keywords to what does that mean and what does that imply? Kind of what's the context behind the image. And of course, then we need to assign this, and they need to be relevant and accurate so that the end users can always get consistent search results. So again, another task really to throw in here. What keywords would you use to describe this photo? And where I'm going here is that if we are all going to look at things differently and have different ways of describing things, how can we start to tame this information and make the information more consistent? So in a previous workshop, these were some examples of keywords that people threw out. And we've got looking, we've got peering, we've got lost, which is a sort of fairly negative connotation, but we've got trapped, which is definitely, more on the negative side. So we've got a variety of things that people have focused on. We've focused on what we think the age of the child is and the gender of the child. So this is a real mixed bag, and this is typical of what happens when we ask people to do keywording. And this is why it's so important, because all this lack of structure means that we have inconsistent, unpredictable, disorganized keywords that can be ambiguous, and obviously they can be subjective as well. And when we're managing and organizing information, we do want to try and create some structure where we possibly can. So the structure could look something like this if we were to follow this basic guiding principle. Who is in the image? What can we see in the image? Where is the image in terms of the setting? Is there anything about the place that this is happening in, the time of this image was taken, or the event that was happening at that time? And why is the image important? What's the meaning there? Thinking back to the image of the child on the train, we've got the child, obviously, we've got objects, we've got the setting, the location, in this case, the train. When did it happen? Well, I was thinking this could be a commuter train, perhaps in the morning, or even coming home in the evening. And some concepts, for example, journey, there could be positive, there could be negative concepts. It depends on the image, case by case. And then if we were to take the kind of random keywords that came out from the first exercise I did and put them into some kind of a structure, it might start to look something like this, where we've broken down keywords into types. So classification and taxonomy, some relationships happening here. Different subjects and topics. We've got concepts, things that are descriptive, so literally the visual elements of the image, and then a few technical terms thrown in as well. And this is something you can do in your organization. You can take a look at the types of keywords that are typically associated with your content and start to organize them in this way. And how would you do that? So you might conduct some research. You might ask your users, your stakeholders, how they search for content, how they keyword content, and use that to start to create a controlled vocabulary. Sorry, I have CV here, but I mean controlled vocabulary. Develop and evolve the keywords in line with your users' needs. So make sure that you're listening to how they search and looking at search logs, seeing what their search process involves. Try and establish some guidelines, so some kind of processes and protocols that people can follow. And also try and track and monitor the user experience. So make sure that you're testing to make sure that the results coming back are accurate, relevant, and consistent. So this flowchart basically reiterates everything I've just said, which would be to construct your controlled vocabulary, you're going to move from a situation where you have unstructured keywords that appear in a system, or with some metadata fields, becomes more of a controlled vocabulary, which becomes more structured, and then therefore you get an improved user experience and usability as a result of that. Here's an example of a piece from a controlled vocabulary where we have a keyword such as bumblebee that could be renamed within your controlled vocabulary to appear as the more preferred term bee. But there's lots of different ways people search for bees. As we've seen in some of the visual examples, people have a whole variety of ways of expressing themselves. So here's a few examples of synonyms that you could add to the keyword bee, or the preferred term bee, to enable customers searching in lots of different ways to also access those images. And if you were to organise this hierarchically within a taxonomic controlled vocabulary, for example, then your bee would obviously be filed or classified under the keyword insect, which is an animal hierarchically. So I'm afraid that I'm going to be running over, but I only have a few more slides. And this is about the conceptual side of keywording, because as you'll see in this slide, blessed are they who see beautiful things in humble places where others see nothing. And I love this quote because when I'm keywording, I often think about what is it that we can't see that is meaningful about an image. And this is where we come down to the idea of concepts. So we've talked a lot about keywords and that they describe what we can actually see, and that they convey ideas and concepts, because images really tell stories, and we need to really capture everything we can about the meaning of an image through the keywords. And one way that I often teach about this or workshop this is through this idea of this ratio 80-20, and you'll see in my little image here that roughly, and this is no hard and fast rule, 80% of the keywords we add are about the visual attributes, so the things we can literally see in the image that everybody would pretty much agree on, followed by around 20% of conceptual keywords. And as we saw in the example of the child on the train, those can vary quite a lot. So we all see a child, we can see the train, we can see the window, but then it's what we do with that information and how we convey that into concepts and how we interpret that changes. And this is quite a helpful way of looking at that in terms of the keywording process. And this is my final illustration example to show you how important concepts are. So this photographer, Philip Enticknap on LinkedIn, he and I often talk about keywording and how important the concepts are, because when this image sold, when this image of Philip sold on a stock library website, it sold on the keywords trust and team. So it wasn't even a customer searching for the red arrows or jet planes or, you know, aircraft transport. It was the concepts, team and trust that sold this image. And Philip was just reiterating the fact that it's also not just what we see, but what it means that's important in the keywording process. So we really need to try and find a way of expressing that in a way that people can follow, and create some guidelines to help people do that. So the 80-20 ratio in terms of this image would say start with the basics and layer up the keywords. Start with who, what, where, when, and then think about the concepts, the ideas, why, what's the purpose and meaning of the image. Because after all, as Philip has proven, the concepts sell the content. So wrapping it up rather swiftly now, my conclusions for today. Keywording is a purpose-led process. We need to try to capture information at source as much as possible. It involves us to monitor the cultural and social changes that are happening in the world. We have to continually edit the language in line with those changes. And we need to try and find ways to educate and train the people doing the keywording, as well as sometimes the customers doing the searching.